Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the 18th Annual CLGS Johnny Boswell Lecture here at Pacific School of Religion. My name is Bernie Schlager. I use he, they pronouns, and I serve as Executive Director of CLGS here at PSR. Please join me in welcoming this year's lecturer, Professor Bryan Massingale of Fordham University, who will be speaking on James Baldwin and Black queer prophetic lament and hope. Welcome, Professor Massingale. We are honored by your presence with us. Today is a rather auspicious day. There is a new bishop in Rome. It is also Dr. Massingale's birthday. So happy birthday to you, Professor. Before I say more by way of introduction, I'd like to share with everyone just some brief housekeeping details for this Zoom webinar. Tonight's lecture and follow-up discussion is being recorded, and this recording will be made available on our website as well as our other socials. We will be using the Q&A feature for questions with Dr. Massingale. He will address these at the conclusion of the lecture this afternoon, this evening. And as you may well know, live transcript, closed captioning is available for the webinar. To view subtitles or live transcript, select the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now I would like to introduce President David Vasquez-Levy, President of Pacific School of Religion. Welcome, Professor and President.
Thank you, Bernie. I greatly appreciate it. Welcome this evening, and a special welcome to Professor Bryan Massingale, and a gratitude for being our speaker for today as we honor the legacy and work of John Boswell. We will hear a bit more about Professor Massingale and also about John Boswell, whose name this series is named. But I want us to take a moment to welcome all of you on behalf of Pacific School of Religion. CLGS will be celebrating its 25th anniversary, 25 years of work here at PSR, really advocating for the full inclusion of people of LGBTQ identities, but more than that, just the idea of inclusion to move well beyond that, to recognizing how much we must be reshaped in how we think theologically, culturally, and socially about issues of human sexuality, and how critical the role of religion is. At the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies and Religion, we recognize the fact that the greatest challenges to inclusion and to the full recognizing the full humanity of LGBTQ people are often articulated on religious terms. Therefore, it is critically important that the work of the center, through its roundtables of various ethnic communities and religious traditions, that we find ways to articulate the value, the importance of inclusion on religious terms, particularly at a time when the rise of Christian nationalism has made it part of its central effort to exclude and to demonize the attacks on some of our communities. Baldwin, whose memory we also recognize today in this lecture, wrote that you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world. But then you read. The reality is that the challenges we are facing today, in many ways unprecedented as they are, new as they are in their virulence and cruelty, they have a legacy, they have a history, they have a DNA that is fed by histories of colonial exclusion, that are fed by the realities of exclusion of people because of their race, the enslavement of Black bodies, the exploitation of Native communities, the dispossessing of others. There is a legacy and a DNA to exclusion. But there is also a DNA that we remember today of communities of resistance that have known that change is possible, that we aspire, and particularly as people of faith, for those of us for whom that is an orientation, for a more perfect world that we imagine. And here at Pacific School of Religion, our commitment is the preparation of spiritually rooted leaders with vision, with resilience, and a skill to create a world where all can thrive. I'm thankful again for Dr. Massingale's willingness to be part of our conversation as we engage on those in the visions that can help us think more broadly about the issues we care about in the world, by the resilience that comes from drawing from a deep well of tradition and history, and by the skills of how we might respond with ability, with wisdom in this moment. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, President David. And now I will introduce more fully tonight's speaker. Bryan Massingale is a Catholic priest of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee who earned his Doctor of Moral Theology degree summa cum laude from the Pontifical Institute for Moral Theology in Rome. He serves as the James and Nancy Buckman Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University and Senior Fellow in its Center for Ethics Education. His distinguished leadership roles include former president of both the Society of Christian Ethics and the Catholic Theological Society of America, and former convener of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium. Thus, Dr. Massingale has authored 2 books and over 200 academic publications. His book, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church, received the first place book award from the Catholic Press Association. He co-edited Did All of Us, A New Agenda for Catholic Theology from Queer Catholics of Color? That's Fortress Press 2025. And also authored Poverty and Racism, Overlapping Threats to the Common Good for Catholic Charities USA. As a public intellectual, he contributes to major Catholic publications and addresses racial and sexual justice issues in global media outlets. His current research explores the Black radical imagination's contributions to Catholic theology, the challenge of white Christian nationalism, and intersections of race, sexuality, and faith. A true scholar activist, Professor Massingale has consulted for numerous organizations, including the US State Department, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the National Black Catholic Congress, Catholic Charities USA, and various religious orders. He advocates for a full inclusion of LGBTQ persons in society and faith communities. His numerous honors include 4 honorary doctorates, Marquette University's highest teaching award, the Kettler Award for Social Justice, Barry University's Yves Congar Award for Theological Excellence, and recognitions from the Catholic Press Association, Pax Christi USA, Dignity USA, and Catholic Charities USA, acknowledging his outstanding contributions to theological scholarship and justice advocacy. And finally, before Professor Massingale begins, I'd like to say just a few words about this annual lectureship. The CLGS John E. Boswell Lecture here at Pacific School of Religion is an endowed lectureship established at the center in 2007 with the aim of bringing leading scholars in religion, spirituality, gender, and sexuality studies to the PSR campus, virtually or live, each spring. What inspired us here at the center and at PSR to name our annual spring lecture series after John Boswell was, in great part, his willingness to take risks in his own scholarship and face those who criticized and even dismissed his work, largely because he chose to write about something that many of his time believed was best left not discussed, something best left in the closet. That is the history of queer people and religion. Over the years, we have welcomed scholars, religious and spiritual leaders, change-making activists, and artists to this lectureship. And what has characterized each Boswell lecturer is their commitment to take risks in their religious leadership, scholarship, activism, and art to help shape a world that, in the words of CLGS's mission statement, a world that advances the well-being of lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and transgender people, and transform faith communities and the wider society by taking a leading role in shaping a new public discourse on religion, gender identity, and sexuality through education, research, community building, and advocacy. And now, with our introductory comments concluded, I am pleased to welcome once again Professor Bryan Massingale as our 18th annual CLGS John E. Boswell Lecturer. He is speaking on James Baldwin and Black queer prophetic lament and hope. Welcome, Dr. Massingale.
Thank you, Bernie, and thank you to the leadership of the Pacific School of Religion for the invitation to deliver this prestigious address. And thank you all for your attendance, your support, and your interest in advancing ideas and ideals that are close to the center of this mission and this identity. Rather than just listening to me or looking at me speak at you, I did prepare a PowerPoint. So let's make sure that we can do this here. All right. Let's see from beginning. There we go. All right. So let's hope this works. So James Baldwin and Black Queer Prophetic Lament and Hope ? And we'll talk more about that in a moment. As we know, academics like sometimes to put an epigram at the beginning of their lectures. And so here is the one that's at the head of this lecture that I wish to give for you today. It comes from James Baldwin's celebrated work, The Fire Next Time, in which he says, yes, it does indeed mean something unspeakable, to be born in a white country, an Anglo-Teutonic anti-sexual country, Black. You very soon, without knowing it, give up all hope of communion. I want to speak just a moment about why it's an honor for me to give this John Boswell lecture. While many of us are familiar with Boswell's path-breaking monographs that document the then little noticed and still controversial reality of same-sex unions in pre-modern Europe, less well known are the lectures he gave to various Catholic LGBTQ groups that documented the acceptance of same-gender, same-sex loving friendships in Catholic monastic life in the same period, in the medieval period. I remember still the thrill of hearing him declare in the 1990s, while he was still a very young priest, that religious life was the quintessential form of gay life in the Middle Ages, and one of its most dominant manifestations into the present. Boswell dared to pierce the veil of shame and secrecy that surrounded the predominance of quote-unquote homosexuality in the priesthood and religious life, a secrecy and shame that sadly are still too real. So it's an honor for me as an openly, publicly gay Catholic priest to give this lecture as a way of giving thanks for John's courageous work, and for helping many he never met come to an acceptance of how God made them and how God called them to serve. Now, I chose a theme of James Baldwin and Black Queer Prophetic Lament. Baldwin is a seminal figure in the canon of Black queer literature. Black and queer, a nexus that is difficult for many to honor. It was difficult during his lifetime, as attested by the attacks that he experienced from some in the civil rights movement and in the Black Panthers for his same-sex affections and relationships. It's a difficult nexus for some white Americans, even white LGBTQ Americans still, as attested by the reception that was given to a major documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. Many of my white gay friends criticized the film with some justification for not dealing directly with Baldwin's non-heteronormative sexuality. But they refused to engage the film's treatments of his condemnations of white supremacy. Their engagement with Baldwin begins and ends with Giovanni's Room, with its portrayal of white same-sex protagonists. Yet Black queer voices claim Baldwin as an essential and valued ancestor. One of the earliest chroniclers of Black gay life, Joseph Beam, praised Baldwin's wisdom and courage in dealing sensitively with both male relationships and the richness of Black culture. Beam especially praised Baldwin's final novel, Just Above My Head, written in 1979. He noted, and I quote here, Heretofore, Black male writers suffered from a kind of nationalistic heterosexism. In other words, there was this belief that to be a strong Black male, you could not be gay. And homophobia always limited the depths to which we as Black gay men could relate, reducing us to stereotypes, speaking slang and aphorisms. And just above my head, in plain view of the Black family, it was possible for two Black men to be lovers and be political and be cherished for who they were. Because he, Baldwin, could envision us as lovers, our possibilities were endless. We could be warriors, artists, and astronauts. We could be severe, sensitive, and philosophical. Now, this essay honors the nexus of being Black and queer by examining Baldwin's later works, such as Just Above My Head, and in developing a Black queer prophetic lament and possibly hope, one that can fuel ethical critique, moral resistance, and communal perseverance as the LGBTQ plus community and persons face what the Human Rights Campaign in 2023 described as, quote, a state of emergency, close quote. I'm going to argue that it's Baldwin's double-sided vision that stems from his dual marginality that gives him deep insight into the intersectional threats that the ascendant ideology of white Christian nationalism poses for those who live non-heteronormative identities and relationships. Now I'm going to focus on his later works, especially his 1971 monograph, No Name in the Street. Now, unlike his earlier, more famous work, The Fire Next Time, No Name was authored after the assassinations of Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and Martin Luther King. Baldwin had to contend with the harsh reality of a nation that failed to heed the message of racial justice advanced by the civil rights movement. This led him to a bleaker analysis of the soul of the nation's white majority than found in his earlier career. This more difficult reading is, I argue, valuable for us in our current moment, as the LGBTQ movement must contend with public vilifications and attempts at censure and erasure, such as book bans, monument strippings, banished histories, and bans on public participation and recognition that are rampant today, and which many of us have believed have been overcome. We are living in dire times after the apparent victories of same-sex marriage and integration into the military. What strategy and hope can be given at this time of severe restriction and retrenchment? Let's explore what Baldwin has to offer. I will proceed in 3 steps. First, I will situate Baldwin within the African-American prophetic tradition and explore the contours of a type of prophetic pessimism. Then I will examine how Baldwin's later work embodies a strain of prophetic pessimism with its paradox of aggressive critique and tenuous hope, fueled by a tension between faith and fury. I finally will consider the lessons that Baldwin, as a bearer of queer paradoxical hope, a blues hope, a stance that refuses easy comfort or refuge in shallow assurance, how that paradoxical hope insists upon a relentless truth-telling and bears witness to injustice, even as it never loses sight of the obstacles that stymie queer flourishing and well-being. It provides a blues hope for queer flourishing and even queer joy. So then let's begin by looking at the African-American prophetic pessimism. The African-American philosopher and public intellectual Cornel West provides a useful examination of the Black American prophetic tradition. He declares that this tradition is rooted in what he calls Pascalian leaps of faith, by which, despite the intransigence of racist evil, human beings are still seen as capable of transforming their circumstances through relentless self-criticism and the quest for social freedom. One of the chief defining characteristics of this tradition, West avows, is what he calls aggressive pessimism. By this, he means that Black prophetic practices often embrace a form of pessimism that, rather than leading to defeat, becomes sobering rather than disabling, a stumbling block, not a dead end, a challenge to meet rather than a conclusion to accept. This aligns with what others see as the broader concept of prophetic pessimism in African American prophetic thought. Eddie Glaude, for example, sees this as a mode of deep critique rooted in love, a critique rooted in historical truth, and a refusal to surrender to delusion or to accommodate delusion. This form of pessimism is not hopelessness. It's rather a sober recognition of the depths of America's moral crisis and the urgent need to confront what Glaude calls the lie at the heart of the American project, namely the value gap that maintains that Black lives are not as valuable as white ones. Now, the African-American rhetorician Andre Johnson provides the most detailed treatment of this mode of prophetic engagement. He treats pessimistic prophecy, which he also calls prophetic lament, as one of the major forms of rhetoric in the African-American prophetic tradition. What distinguishes it is a paradoxical embodiment of both pessimism and hope. This paradox between hope and grief, faith and fury, is the emotional and the theological ground for prophetic pessimism. Johnson lists the following key characteristics of this specific genre of religious engagement. It's characterized by public lamentation. The prophet gives public voice to the suffering of the community, especially giving voice to those that are not able to speak publicly for themselves. This prophetic pessimism is rooted in a recollection of past events. The prophet draws on history to highlight and explain the community's present trials, ordeals, and conditions. A distinguishing and essential feature of prophetic pessimism is that the prophet functions not as a witness, but not necessarily as a catalyst for change. The prophet in this tradition does not aim to change circumstances, but rather acts as a witness to the pain and suffering of their community. The goal is not transformation, but articulation. Simply to speak, to get the audience to hear, and thus becoming a record chronicling the witness and chronicling the pains and sufferings of the people that the prophet claims to represent. And finally, let's move that on. Finally, despite the bleak prospects and hopes for change, this prophetic articulation is a coping strategy that wards against communal nihilism. Johnson writes, quote, "By speaking, the prophet offers hope and encouragement to others by acknowledging their suffering and letting them know that they're not alone." Close quote. Prophetic lament through the public articulation of protest and grief becomes therapeutic and temporarily eases frustration. In another place, Johnson avows that Black prophetic pessimism's hope is not in the dismantling of white supremacy, but in African Americans reclaiming their agency and rejecting the internalized anti-Blackness that's imposed by society. This refusal to offer easy answers or to comfort people with illusions is essential to prophetic pessimism. The prophet here mourns publicly and forces the community to face what it seeks to ignore. Prophetic pessimism then does not mean giving up. It embraces mourning as a form of truth-telling. This form of prophecy refuses easy comforts and happy endings. It refuses the illusion that things are improving just because people want or need to believe that. Instead, the prophetic pessimism speaks grief and protest loudly and unsparingly because the truth must be spoken, even if it changes nothing. Now, Eddie Glaude views this prophetic pessimism as an accurate reflection of Baldwin's own moral arc, a recognition that recognizes that while change is possible, the nation's deep denial and unwillingness to change makes it highly unlikely. Baldwin writes, white people have to accept their history and their actual circumstances, and they won't. Not without a miracle, they won't. This stark statement expresses the core of Baldwin's pessimism, that white America's refusal to reckon with the truth makes moral transformation nearly impossible. Baldwin's growing despair led him to shift from appealing to white America to strengthening Black communities. He writes, "We cannot awaken the sleeper, and God knows we have tried. We must do what we can do and fortify and save each other." This shift marks a decisive turn in Baldwin's public engagement and thinking. So let's now turn to an examination of this shift. So we can see Baldwin as this prophetic pessimist who says that while change is not necessarily likely, it does not mean that human agency comes to an end. So Baldwin is a prophet of pessimistic hope. I want to explore this stance as it develops in his later works, especially No Name and the Street, and how this work embodies both aggressive critique and tenuous hope. Now, I cannot do justice to the rich and demanding meditation that Baldwin provides in this, the fourth of his 5 major nonfiction monographs, and the first one written post-1968, and the date's significance will be explained further below. I want to just lift up the following points. First, the structure of the work, marked by fractured memory. Now, Baldwin's work is often marked by a non-linear style. He often employs a meditative or ruminating presentation that weaves disparate events together in an extended narrative, moving from A to B, then to D, then re-examining A in light of D. But this work, No Name in the Street, is very disjointed. There is no apparent structure that holds the work together. Baldwin moves from event to event with no evident sequence, from treating Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, then to school desegregation battles in Little Rock, Arkansas, then to his early days in Paris, a meditation on the Algerian freedom struggle and the plight of Algerians in Paris, then to his earliest memories of childhood, his experiences during his first tour of the South in the early 1960s, his encounters with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, his aborted attempt to write a screenplay of Malcolm X's life and the superficiality of Hollywood, and his unsuccessful efforts to free a friend unjustly imprisoned in Germany. The account seems disjointed, random, and scattered. But Baldwin provides an early cue as to the reason for this scattergun approach, writing, much has been blotted out. coming back only lately in bewildering and untrustworthy flashes. Since Martin's death in Memphis and that tremendous day in Atlanta, meaning the day of King's funeral, something has altered in me. Something has gone away. Perhaps even more than the death itself, the manner of the death has forced me into a judgment concerning human life and human beings, which I have always been reluctant to make. He continues, incontestably, alas, most people are not in action worth very much. And yet every human being is an unprecedented miracle. One tries to treat them as the miracles that they are while trying to protect oneself from the disasters they've become. This work then is a recollection of trauma memories, fragments and flashbacks of memories written as a way of processing severe crises. This work is a trauma narrative written in the aftermath of the assassinations of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. Baldwin's biographers note how, especially after King's death, his murder, Baldwin experienced a deep depression, one from which some believe he never fully recovered. He left the country for an extended period of self-imposed exile from 1968 to 1970, seeking refuge and healing far away in Turkey. Critics note how the tone of his writings post-1968 changed. Gone is the tentative optimism with which he concluded The Fire Next Time, the hope that an interracial coalition of a handful of relatively conscious Blacks and whites could help the country emerge out of its racial nightmare. Much as PTSD survivors ruminate upon the traumas that trigger their memories, Baldwin's disjointed narrative is his attempt to explain a new realization that he's come to about America and his loss of faith that meaningful progress is possible. He writes, one could scarcely be deluded about Americans anymore. One scarcely dared expect anything from the great, vast, blank generality. And yet one was compelled to demand of Americans, for their sakes, after all, a generosity, a clarity, and a nobility which they did not dream of demanding of themselves. The structure of the work is part of the message. The searing effects of trauma arising from what he considers as definitive rejections of African-American efforts to move the nation out of its commitment to the ideology and practices of white supremacy. Following upon this, we see Baldwin treat the intransigence of social evil. The assassinations of these three major leaders leads Baldwin to a deep pessimism about the prospects of meaningful change. Barely 5 years after The Fire Next Time, Baldwin's bleak assessment is even more dire. Observing the relentless hostility and official persecution of the Black Panther movement, young Black activists who were the heirs of Malcolm X, and the new form of the racial justice quest, think of the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, Baldwin declared, noting J. Edgar Hoover's implacable hostility, quote, those who rule the country are determined to smash the Panthers, and not, alas, because they are ashamed of the truth the Panthers are revealing about the Black situation, but because they have no intention to change it. They cannot afford to change it. They would not know how to go about changing it, even if their imaginations were capable of encompassing the concept of Black freedom. Such a reality could only be conceived of them as a nightmare. Blacks have never been free in this country, never was it intended that they should be free. Note how Baldwin believes this near impossibility of deep social change is rooted in an atrophied social imaginary. But that constricted imaginary reflects an almost visceral terror in the generality of white Americans. He writes, for any real commitment to Black freedom in this country would have the effect of reordering all of our priorities and altering all of our commitments. In short, American identity and the personal identities of many white people will have to be completely changed for Black freedom to become a reality. And such wholesale transformation was, for most, Baldwin believed too terrifying to contemplate. This leads to the next major theme in his work, and that is the fear of the erotic. Baldwin sees a deep connection between the rejection of Black equality and the sexual fears of many white Americans. The suppression, denial, even terror surrounding what Audre Lorde calls the erotic leads to the projection of the erotic onto scapegoats, in this case, Black folks, and later we'll see onto queer folks. And that projection of a denied erotic leads to a loss of moral sensibility and responsibility. Indeed, Baldwin avows this fear of the erotic makes people, quote, moral monsters, unquote. This fear of authentic sexuality and deep human connection, this interior estrangement from what one might call the soul, leads Baldwin to observe what he calls an unbelievable dimension of sorrow among and within Americans, the consequence and the outcome of a constrained, conflicted, and confoundingly truncated inner life. Thus, Baldwin reaches the following moral judgment, quote, in the generality, as social and moral and political and social entities, white Americans are probably the sickest and certainly the most dangerous people of any color to be found in the world today. As a consequence, the ruthless suppression of Black freedom and the crushing of any dissenting voices that would force a confrontation with truth, these become totally inimical to a meaningful democracy. Maintaining subjugation requires, in a word, what Baldwin calls tyranny. He writes, when power translates itself into tyranny, it means that the principles upon which that power dependent and which were its justification are bankrupt. When this happens, and it is happening now, power can only be defended by thugs and mediocrities and seas of blood. Such a government, Baldwin avowed, can only rule by fear and force. The fears of the people who elected them and the fear that the administration can inspire. That's his quote. The relevance of these observations for our current moment are only too clear. But what are the implications of Baldwin's prophetic pessimism for white queers, also known as flower children, and the limits for genuine solidarity? Baldwin deals at some length with the consequences of these realizations for whites who imagine themselves in solidarity with Black aspirations. These are called the flower children, that is, young white radicals or dissenters who wanted a different society, one of genuine equality. Many of these flower children we now know were sexual minorities, who today would be called queer. Baldwin relates his discussions with them while visiting San Francisco, and reports being moved by the sincerity of their questions and their desire to know what they could do. Yet he sensed that they were not so much distressed by the country's racial situation, but rather thoughtful and uneasy at the prospect of the limited options they would face if they strove to be in genuine solidarity. He writes, quote, "Their moral obligations to their darker brother, if they were real, and if they were really to be acted on, placed them in conflict with all they loved and all that had been given to them as an identity. They were far from judging or repudiating the American state as oppressive or immoral. They were merely profoundly uneasy." Baldwin further explains that the insights that many white queers gained from their limited efforts at racial solidarity led to a dawning realization that the nation's commitment to white supremacist rule was only one aspect of the fraudulent nature of American life. This led the white flower children to the uncomfortable and unsettling realization of the limits and the price of their own freedom. Baldwin writes, quote, "They were privileged and secure only as so long as they did, in effect, what they were told. But they had been raised to believe that they were free." Close quote. The cost and dangers of genuine freedom and maturity for white people short-circuited the limited possibilities for genuine cross-racial solidarity. The price of freeing themselves from the lies and delusions of American life was simply just too high. As a result, there were few Blacks found among the flower children. Baldwin relates that they never believed in the delusions of American life and, quote, couldn't put their trust in flowers, close quote. And thus Baldwin has, as we will see later, a dim view of the 1970s gay and lesbian liberation movements, fearing that they were fueled less by a desire for social transformation and more by a quest to be integrated into the privileges enjoyed by white males. And so why hope? By now, it's readily apparent that Baldwin saw the possibility for genuine social justice to be a very slim one. Yet he persisted in its public witness. There are several reasons for his perseverance in the face of almost no realistic prospect of success. For one, in his later works, he treats of the obligation he felt to be a witness to all that Evers, Malcolm, and King stood for. Over and over, he said, quote, "I am the last witness. I am the only one left," close quote. Baldwin's fidelity to his friends leads him to stay steadfast despite his personal grief, and even if he must adopt the posture and oratory of public lament. Secondly, Baldwin continues to speak out despite the heedlessness of the white majority because of his love and concern for Black people. He writes, "Yes, it was important for white people to hear it, if they were still able to hear, but it was of the utmost importance for Black people to hear it for the sake of their morale. It was important for them to know that there was someone like them in public life telling the truth about their condition." That becomes a ground for hope and continued activism. Baldwin also relates that he continues to raise his voice despite limited prospects of success because such an outcome cannot be absolutely foreclosed. Force and fear, he observed, are a shaky foundation for social stability. The American project, he believed, is destined for failure because despite its best efforts, the guardians of the white status quo are unable to definitively crush Black efforts and aspirations for a new society. Baldwin writes that these young Black activists might not know the precise shape of the future, but they know the future belongs to them. They realize, paradoxically, by the failure of the moral energy of their oppressors, and begin almost instinctively to forge a new morality, to create the principles on which a new world will be built. And yet, it's important to note that this hope is still extremely circumscribed. Baldwin admits that this creation of a new society and a new people, quote, seems as unlikely as fashioning the proverbial bricks without straw, close quote. By any measure, the cost will be enormous. And so he concludes on a bleakly tenuous note of blues hope, a note that conveys disillusionment without defeat, saying that one speaks out of a passionate love for the nation. To be an Afro-American or an American Black is to be in a situation of those who have found themselves part of a civilization which they could now in no ways honorably defend, which they were compelled indeed endlessly to attack and condemn, and yet who spoke out of the most passionate love, hoping to make the kingdom new, to make it honorable and worthy of life. Or in plainer speech, as he said in an interview near the end of his life, clinging to a hope expressed in blue tinged in irony, I live a hope despite my knowing better, because you can't tell the children there is no hope. Thus, in the end, Baldwin's prophetic pessimism was not a surrender to despair. Despite the nation's moral obtuseness and commitment to the delusions of superiority, Baldwin does not abandon his public warnings to white Americans or his calls to Black self-preservation and resilience. His prophetic pessimism is a call to moral seriousness, to radical honesty, and to love, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Love can be a revolutionary force. So what of Baldwin and queer hope for today? I undertook this project as a means of offering a resource for how the LGBTQ plus community can find a way for further activism, for political activism rather, for social striving and communal hope in the face of the ferocious curtailment of our rights under this present administration. Book purges, the dismissal of trans troops, the revision of the history of Stonewall. These assaults, I maintain, are nothing less than a desire to eradicate LGBTQ persons from public existence. Yet some may wonder what relevance Baldwin's prophetic pessimism offers to the LGBTQ community, as it focuses mainly on the threat of white supremacy and the realities that attend racial subordination. This would seem somewhat distant from the concerns of white LGBTQ folks who constitute the majority of the population in the United States. This lack of concern of the majority of white queers for racial justice is sadly one that has marked this community historically and continues today. In my lectures on white Christian nationalism that I give to predominantly white LGBTQ audiences, I stress a reality which seems counterintuitive, especially to white Americans, that in the United States, white is not a skin color, but a social status. I repeat, white is not a skin color, it's a social status. Indeed, the category of white is a fluid one. Throughout our history, Groups have lost, for example, Mexican Americans, and gained, for example, the Irish and the Greeks, the status of white and the privileges that accrue to those granted that status in a society that protects and advances white entitlement. Accordingly, the ideology of white supremacy, of white Christian nationalism rather, prescribes certain groups from being considered as white. Proponents of this worldview believe, quote, God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society that could be an example to the rest of the world. Surveys discover that 30% of all Americans agree with that statement, including 31% of all white Catholics, 55% of Republicans, and 56% of white evangelicals. Note, the core supporters of the current administration. But what makes this especially relevant to this lecture's audience is the finding of the PRRI Institute in 2023, that belief in America as a divinely ordained white Christian nation is strongly linked to denials of structural racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitism, anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment, support for patriarchal gender roles, and even support for political violence. In other words, white Christian nationalism is an intersectional reality. To put this in my Catholic terms, white Christian nationalism is a consistent ethic of hatred and intolerance. The ideology of white supremacy is a seamless garment of intersectional exclusion. To put this bluntly, in America today, white LGBTQ plus folks are not white enough. There is always an asterisk beside their white identities. This is why LGBTQ folks are being subjected to severe social ostracism and exclusions today, despite their white skin color. Now, this may come as a terrible shock and an awful truth for some to face, because, like many white Americans, they have been socialized into what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wages of whiteness. That is, the belief that despite their hardships, there is a social class, namely Black folks and others of color, that remain inferior to them. And therefore, as long as they prove themselves, they can be assimilated into the ranks of white male privilege. Note J.D. Vance's comments about how normal gays would support Trump as opposed to trans folks. This is because, like the follower children described by Baldwin, the queers of his time, many white LGBTQ folks have been raised to believe that the country should work for them. But the book purges, the prohibition of gay history, the prohibition of discussions of LGBTQ topics in schools, all of these belie the idea that there are normal gays in the minds of white Christian nationalists. Given the intransigence of white supremacy and its influence on U.S. queer lives, Baldwin's complex embrace of hope, a blues hope, a hope that conveys disillusionment without defeat, an aggressive pessimism that is sobering rather than disabling, this can be a valuable resource that is both soberingly realistic and yet empowering. Baldwin's proto-intersectionality. Baldwin was intersectional before there was the classification of intersectional. It becomes a template, a forebearer for a form of queer public lament. Inspired by Baldwin, queer activists can be empowered to speak and give voice to the voiceless, even if the prospects for success seem limited and perhaps even futile. For prophetic pessimism, lamentation avows that even if there is little hope for immediate social change, expressing outrage and mourning, chronicling suffering, resistance, and joy amidst it all. That's why I love this picture of Baldwin dancing with Lorraine Hansberry. Chronicling joy in the midst of it all can enable the community to endure and continue to struggle. Lamentation helps a person cope with the struggle and abates, at least for a while, the frustration that one feels about one's situation. Lamentation allows the community to understand and realize they are not alone nor isolated in their suffering. Now, I realize that some queer activists may find this stance inadequate. They may question whether such a pessimism is robust enough to fuel and sustain a social movement for change and transformation. I hear that and I understand. It is the root of my disagreement with forms of Afro-pessimistic discourse, particularly those that assume that the assumptions of Black subhumanity are so thoroughly baked into the fabric of Western society that change is not only inconceivable, but impossible. But even so, the present moment that the LGBTQ plus community lives in runs the risk of engendering passivity, especially as many forms of political and institutional resistance to the current administration's war on DEI and government by decree seem to be weak and ineffective. The times we are living in are dangerous in ways that are beyond the living memory of most of us. Merely appealing to past victories, such as same-sex civil marriage and the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, they ring with increasing hollowness as efforts to undo the repeals pick up steam. In the face of this onslaught, we need practices of critique wedded to discourses of hope. Baldwin provides one such resource of a sore-tried hope and of enduring love that can inspire genuinely intersectional alliances and struggles. The only ones, intersectional alliances and struggles, the only struggles and alliances that have a chance of holding at bay the forces of nihilism that threaten to overwhelm us. For even if we cannot envision the dismantling of white supremacy and its attendant homo and transphobia, we can still reclaim the agency to reject the internalized homophobia and transphobia that's imposed by an awful society. We can be inspired by the legacies of the African enslaved, who taught that the greatest form of resistance to enslavement was survival and never surrendering the capacity to love. This is the legacy that Baldwin leaves us at this time of trial. A legacy that is maybe only at the beginning stages of gathering steam and force as the sword hangs over our heads. In this situation, his articulation of a blues-tinged hope can sustain us. A hope that is a pessimistic lamentation that is relentlessly honest about griefs and trials of LGBTQ lives. A prophetic pessimism that is insistent upon the voice and agency that can arise even in the midst of struggle. A Black queer lament that avows that even if and when social transformation seems a dim possibility, one can still craft in nature the love for the Black queer self and celebrate what Baldwin calls the gods that bless queer love. And a Black queer lament, hope and joy that cultivates joy in the midst of struggle and celebrates the resilience of love. A joy, a love that loves oneself and one's community, as the womanist would say, regardless. Regardless. Nowhere is this conviction better expressed than in one of Baldwin's final interviews, when he conveyed his hope using the words of the Bible's final book, the book of Revelation. He stated, "The day will come when you will trust you more than you do now, and you will trust me more than you do now, and we can trust each other. I do believe, I really do believe in the New Jerusalem. I really do believe that we can all become better than we are. I know we can. But the price is enormous, and people are not yet willing to pay it. People are not ready yet to pay the high price that racial and sexual justice demands. But Baldwin never foreclosed the capacity of human beings to be better and to do better. He never lost hope. That yet, not yet, is a slender hope, a hope that is sore tried, a hope that is blue, a hope that is real, a hope that is Black and queer." Thank you so much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Massingale, for the wonderful lecture. And everyone, some questions are coming in now, so please put them in the Q&A feature, and I'll help to referee them. Let me begin, if I might. This is from Rosalind. It'll take me a little while to read it, but let me read it, if I might. Would the Black and queer intersectionality benefit from a new framework? Recessive grief, in quotation marks. Recessive grief could be seen as a subcategory or root of masked grief. While masked grief is a behavior, recessive grief focuses on the unique grief individuals face due to the repeated exposure to the disintegration of collective cultural supports. Scientifically, in our biological systems, dominant genes play a crucial role in suppressing the expression of recessive genes. Recessive genes are understood as those that may go undetected as other dominant genes effectively blanket their presence. Just as dominant genes shield us from harm, protective social systems, such as our family, church, community support networks, access to education, and legal safeguards, serve as our societal guardians. Recessive grief metaphorically represents the breakdown of societal structures that typically help individuals cope with loss and trauma. Thank you, Rosalind, for that.
Yes. I'm not familiar with the concept of recessive grief. I'd like to learn more about it. But I would say that I think what Rosalind is articulating is the idea that I'm trying to express with through Baldwin, and that is that we have to resist the urge to easy comforts. I think that there's a tendency that we need to build social movements upon this myth of inevitable progress. And I think that we need to kind of understand that, that the LGBTQ community is in a moment where I think we have to have a deeper look at the American project and perhaps understand that our situation is far more precarious than we want to ever realize. I think that I know among my students, especially my undergrad students, there was this myth that, well, we couldn't ever go back to that. They've never known a world without same-sex marriage. And the idea that this could all be taken away just seems something that's overwhelming to them. And I do think we need to be able to provide resources that are authentically rooted in our queer traditions, such as Baldwin's, that show that there is a way of not only enduring, but thriving, even in the midst of an arduous quest for the recognition of our humanity.
Thank you, Professor Massingale. We have a thank you from Lee. I don't have a question. I want to say thank you. So thank you.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate that.
And then from Professor Ruiz, I am convinced that pessimism is important because it speaks to a reality of the historical oppression of people of color, white queers, and especially queer people of color. My question is, must pessimism always accompany hope? Or are there times when it is fruitful to ground hope solely in joy and cultural celebration with an eye toward futurity? Must pessimism occupy our minds and our daily lives all the time, or is there something to be said in favor of tempering our pessimism every once in a while?
Thank you for that question, Ish. Let's see. I used to think like you did, Ish. As I get older, I find that I become more pessimistic. I have to say that I wrote this because I'm a little concerned that especially white queer authors who treat futurity do not take the reality of an intransigence of evil and tragedy seriously enough. And so I'm basically trying to have an intervention there. And it's the pessimism that I'm offering, as I try to emphasize toward the end, doesn't exclude joy, not at all. But it's this idea that there is joy even in the midst of this pessimism, that this pessimism is an aggressive pessimism. Yeah, I don't want to temper it. I want to be able to hold it in paradoxical tension with each other. And I think the older I get, the more I appreciate more and more paradox. And for me, one of the things I'm grappling with in my research, and this is part of a larger research project, is the fact that communities that are in struggle, especially African-American communities, we never cease to dream despite the reality, the harsh realities that we're in. And these dreams are not in denial, but they are actually coexisting at one and the same time. And so, yeah, I don't want to, maybe it's a function of age, I'm more than willing to say that. But I do think that the older I get, the more I see that we are really in an intransigent state, and we need to find ways of holding together pessimism, hope, and joy.
Thank you. And this is from Reverend Ann Jefferson. Thank you for this powerful lecture, Dr. Massingale, so needed for this time we are in. I feel the dual reality of the weight of the grief, but the irrepressible spirit of hope that just won't die. And we will never be eradicated. We know this in our bones and in our DNA. Again, thank you.
That was I always appreciate people who can put in 30 seconds what I had to take, 50 minutes to articulate. So thank you so much. I appreciate that.
And this comes from Dundee. Thank you, Dr. Massingale. Have you seen or felt a change in the hope your students express, particularly your Black and queer students, either post-Obama or in the Trump era? How has your hopefulness changed?
I think this lecture was a way of trying to articulate how my hopefulness has changed. I think for my students, especially Black queer students, one of the things that's most distressing to me is how few of them know their history. So for example, they don't have a deep rooted in this sense, a deep enough sense of the struggles that we've gone through and the resources that we have within our culture that can enable them to thrive. Most of them don't know anything about Malcolm X. All they know about Martin Luther King is that he had a dream. They don't know what his dream was, but they know he had one. They know almost nothing about Baldwin. Stonewall, even for many white queer people, they don't know anything about the struggles of Stonewall. So they didn't even get the idea of, okay, they took, I literally had an undergraduate tell me, so they took the trans out of the Stonewall monument. What's the big deal? Because they had no idea. Now, this is a function of our American educational system. I keep telling them, it's not your fault that you don't know these things. We should ask yourself, why don't you know? Who doesn't want you to know? And why don't they want you to know this? So how have my students' hopes changed? I think they've changed because I think they've gotten, if not despairing, they've gotten numb. And I think the way many people are getting through the current moment is by numbing themselves to what is happening. They simply check out. They're not aware of it. As long as it doesn't immediately impact me, then I'm not going to bother with it. And I think one of the reasons why they numb out is because they feel isolated and because they don't have a sense of history. They don't have a sense that they belong to a culture. One of the most moving things that ever happened to me is when I was teaching this unit on Stonewall, and one of my queer students came up to me and said, "Thank you. I never knew I had a history." And that, by the way, is why the current administration is waging war on the teaching of queer history, because they understand that history, even when it talks about our struggles and our trials, it can be empowering, because it shows that even as we struggled, we also partied and celebrated. In an earlier draft of this, I had in a treatment of Alan's book, there is a disco ball between us. And the fact that even at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, that we still found ways to celebrate life and to celebrate each other. And that's what I'm trying to get at with this sense of prophetic pessimism. That yes, we get turned off by that word pessimistic because it's so anti-American. And that's precisely why it's so important, because the American project wants to make us see that if things aren't optimistic, then they're not worth pursuing. And I think this administration wants to rob us of optimism. And I want to say, yes, take away my optimism, that's just an American virtue anyway, but don't touch hope. And this hope is really important. An aggressive pessimism that never concedes defeat.
Thank you. We have time for a few more, and we have a number still coming in. So first of all, Professor Susan Abraham, not a question, but deep gratitude for your witness and presence, Dr. Massingale.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. I hope to see you in Portland in June. So thank you.
This is from Raquel. Happy birthday, Professor Massingale, and thank you.
Yay.
What hope will the new Pope offer to the LGBTQ plus community moving forward? What must that hope convey to Black queer individuals?
That's a good question, and I think the jury is frankly out. I think we're still learning so much about Pope Leo XIV. I think I've been doing some search on social media, and posts are coming in. There's something circulating in social media about some comments that he gave in 2012 that were very negative about same-sex relationships and their effects upon culture. And I want to put that in context. One, the statements were made in 2012 when Pope Benedict was Pope. Prior to Pope Francis's groundbreaking question, "Who am I to judge?" And we also have to remember that Pope Francis, the Pope that many celebrate now, was not the Pope Francis that became Pope in 2013. In other words, Pope Francis had to go through an arc of development and transformation. And even though I would say that he was one of the most transformational popes in terms of opening doors in the Catholic Church that I never thought would be open in my lifetime, it's a witness that's still incomplete. And toward the end, I mean, he was, justly criticized for using a slur to refer to gay priests, one that I publicly criticized him about. So even as he was transformational in terms of his engagement with the LGBTQ community, Pope Francis had his blind spots, his growing edges, his places where he needed continued conversion. No doubt, Pope Leo XIV will have also areas of growth and conversion that he will have to undergo when it comes to looking at the LGBTQ community. And the only way in which they can grow is by Black queers and other queer Catholics being proactive witnesses and speaking the truth of our lives, the truth of our loves, and trusting in how the Holy Spirit is working in our own lives, and continuing to speak of the presence of love and the presence of the divine in our lives, in our loves. I think that's how I think Pope Leo is going to have to grow, as all church leaders have to grow if the Catholic Church is going to become the less and less imperfect witness that I believe it's called to be.
Thank you. We will take three more comments, questions. The next one, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Chitoka. Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon once said, "Tell your truth even if they say it's a lie. Tell it anyways, knowing that the goal is not transformation, but articulation to get the audience to listen." As a preacher, how do I preach to congregants who are looking for a way to transform and not necessarily the articulation of words that inform? Chitoka is a chaplain.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, again, as I was composing this lecture, I realized that one of the greatest impediments of the lecture is that giving up the hope of transformation is something that seems to fly in the face of our American DNA. We want to believe that we can make a difference, or we can actually change things. And what I'm trying to articulate, that Baldwin is trying to articulate, is that there are times, there are moments, scenes, epochs in history where that simply isn't possible. And so if we're in such an epoch, what then do we do? And if we believe that our only moral worth or moral option is transformation or capitulation, then our options are very limited indeed. Baldwin was living at a time when he honestly saw that the country had definitively rejected any kind of movement toward real transformation, and he was trying to articulate there is another way of being. And I think that's the message that is a very difficult message for religious folks to say. If I were going to give this a more extended kind of Christian reading, Baldwin, of course, abandoned the Christian church, but he never left the religion of Christ. I would say that this is a theology that's akin to a Holy Saturday. How do we live in that time, in that empty space, when we're not sure what will follow or if anything will follow? And going back to the question with Ish, this is the problem with futurity, is that it assumes that there's going to be a future. And I think that what we're trying to articulate is that, yes, there is, but we have to be really careful we don't move to that too quickly. And so to answer this question about how to articulate that, I think one of the things we have to do is to help our people come to understand that there is a distinction between being, I'll put this in my Christian reference, a good Christian and a good American, and that, American optimism, sometimes the only thing we can do, genuine solidarity, is by being honest, relentlessly honest about who we are, and where we stand. And that stance of prophetic honesty is itself a helpful witness, that someone dares to bear witness is a way of saying there is a future, even if that future is hard to perceive, the exact contours of it.
Thank you, Professor. Two more questions. This one is from David. In a sober assessment of how we got to this point, where commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion have been demonized, what might we consider in reframing these critical projects without taking responsibility for the action of homophobic and xenophobic leaders? How might progressive leaders do our work differently to connect with those we seek to partner with in liberation, but who have not resonated with the language and approach we have taken?
I would question that in terms of I'm not so sure. The problem isn't with the language, okay? I mean, the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion are not new attacks. Okay, before it was diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was affirmative action, it was multiculturalism, it was diversity and inclusion, it was diversity, equity, inclusion, it became diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. What they all have in common is that they were limited efforts to attack the system of racial caste in this country. That is what is problematic with diversity, equity, and inclusion, not the language. What's problematic is its goal, with its aim. And so I'm not so willing to surrender the language of, I'm not wedded to the language of diversity. I think it's kind of weak, actually. I would say I don't want diversity. I want transformation. I want liberation. I want salvation. I'm willing to talk in those terms, but I think we need to push back even more strongly than we are, rather than to concede the territory. I'm not willing to concede that argument. When you're blaming, plane crashes on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I mean, that's just nonsense. When you are trying to rewrite the history of the Underground Railroad and trying to erase Harriet Tubman out of that narrative, that's not, the problem with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I admit that they're very successful at demonizing. I think that what we need to be better at as a Christian community, as a faith community, as a community of justice, we need to be better at sanctifying this language rather than demonizing it. Because what they're after, that we have to understand that the efforts at demonizing diversity, equity, inclusion are nothing less than the eradication of the possibility of a nation of racial, gender, and sexual equality. That's what's really underneath these attacks. And so I don't want to get caught up on whether it should be called diversity, equity, and inclusion. I don't care. What I'm more concerned about is the underlying goal and the dismantling of the system of racial, gender, and sexual caste in this country. And I think we can get too distracted by whether we call it DEI or affirmative action or multiculturalism. No matter what you call it, it is always going to be controversial, because there are many in this country that don't want to dismantle that caste system. That's what's fundamentally at work here. And I think we need to be honest about what we're really up against.
David, did you have another comment?
Oh, no, sorry. Did I unmute accidentally?
Yeah, no,
No,
that's
thank
okay.
you. That was a wonderful reflection and fully agree.
And then before we have our final question, Ms. Ann has amen, lest we contort ourselves and inadvertently bow down to the empire.
Mm.
And then finally from Birta, thank you for your engaging lecture, Professor Massingale. Anytime we say queer in a public space, a little revolution happens, I believe. So thank you for speaking revolution into reality. Would you say that the paradigm belief of the cross and resurrection speaks to, relates to the holding of prophetic pessimism, hope, and joy that you speak about?
Mm. Yeah, if I were going to write this in my own words instead of Baldwin's words, I would say that my hope I would describe as a cruciform hope. It's a hope that is a hope that only is in existence because it goes to the cross and through the cross, but never around the cross. I think that, if the preacher in me wants to say that, unfortunately, we Christians are better at wearing a cross than bearing a cross. And I think that the cruciform understanding that genuine justice and breakthroughs only come through the reality of crucifixion. Crucifixion meaning unjust suffering that has been politically and religiously legitimated by the power of empire and by the false prophets in collusion with empire. That's what crucifixion is. It's unjust suffering. It's unjust torture. It's unjust premature death. And so my cruciform hope, if I were to articulate it, would be that hope that we cannot take crucified peoples off of the cross, to use John Sobrino's words, if we're not willing to go to the cross and through the cross ourselves. And the only thing that leads us to go through the cross is resurrection, the hope of resurrection. But remember, even the resurrected body bore wounds and scars. That the disciples rejoiced, but they rejoiced only because they saw the wounds and scars. So it's holding together the suffering and the joy, the pessimism of the cross, and yet the hope that there is something that lies beyond it. And that gives us the courage to go to it so we may eventually go through it.
Thank you so much, Professor Massingale. We are honored by your presence and really grateful for your words this evening, this afternoon. Thank you, everyone. We invite you to go to our webpage to see what is up at CLGS and Pacific School of Religion. We're very proud to announce 2 weeks ago, our first volume of Boswell lectures has been published. You can check that out on our website. And we always appreciate your support in whatever form that takes. Thank you again, Professor Massingale. Happy birthday. Many more to you. And thank you again for being a part of this lecture series. We really are grateful.
It's been my joy, my pleasure. Thank you, Bernie.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone.